sir.
Thank you, Kevin.
Good afternoon. We welcome home today a son of Cleveland and a sterling product of Jesuit education. Daniel Henninger is a graduate of St. Ignatius High School and Georgetown University. Those of you who have not fallen away, glory be to God, will know that Mr. Henninger is also the product of a proud Cleveland family that has for more than 80 years kept Northeast Ohio's priests and altar servers properly dressed and maintained laypersons in all manner of religious paraphernalia. Mr. Henninger is deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. His column, titled Wonderland, appears in the Journal every Thursday. The same day my column appeared in the Plain Dealer until recently. Most people think I moved to Wednesday because Thursday is no longer a home delivery day, but I actually did so that when I write on the same subject as Daniel Henninger and both of us reach the same conclusions, at least I'm doing it first. Mr. Henninger is also a contributor of Fox News, where he appears weekly on the Journal editorial report. My experience of his work, whether on paper or on the air, has been that he makes a great deal of sense, which is important, and that Father Stryker would approve of his grammar, syntax, and vocabulary, which is more important. In recent months, he's written that the breakdown of trust in all three branches of the federal government would produce a popular backlash, and that life under a surveillance regime that includes not only what the NSA and the IRS learn about us from our formal transactions with the government, but also the stuff they pick up when we Facebook our kids, that too will produce a popular backlash. And that as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act takes full effect with its increasing costs and decreasing access to treatment, just the software glitches will be sufficient to produce a popular backlash. So let's face it, the man is a born optimist. Our outlooks are so similar, I've come to believe that if I were an optimist, I might be the deputy editorial page director of the Wall Street Journal instead of the deputy editorial page director of the Plain Dealer. But that is not a price I am willing to pay. I cherish my pessimism. But now it's my great privilege to introduce to you an outstanding columnist with a shelf full of journalistic honors to prove it, including a share of the Pulitzer Prize, who has yet managed not to let either accolades or a professional lifetime in newsrooms interfere with his ability to think straight. If there's anything I'm optimistic about, it's that we all have something to learn today from Daniel Henninger. Mr. Henninger, if you would.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I think I just learned something, which is that if you're going to give a speech, try to be introduced by a good editorial writer, because you'll know it's going to be literate. And that was. Thanks, Kevin. I am truly thrilled and honored to be here back in Cleveland and among the community of Ignatius and the extended Jesuit community. It's just terrific. Kevin quoted a little bit from some of my recent columns, and I have kind of had the experience recently of people coming up to me and saying, or writing me emails as they do after these things and saying, I really liked that column, but boy, it was really grim. And I kind of bill this talk that I'm going to give you folks today as basically one of, believe it or not, optimism. And but I have to say, with every passing day, it seems increasingly ridiculous to try to say anything positive or optimistic, because it's such a mess down there. But we can get to that later, I suppose, in the Q&A. But we're going to try to wend our way through a few subjects here that I hope end on a note of optimism, which I do think is out there. I had hoped somehow to try to talk today without talking about Barack Obama. But then you might reasonably ask, why are we here? If a political writer from the Wall Street Journal editorial page isn't going to talk about Obama, what else is there to talk about? And yes, indeed, that's the question. What else is there to talk about? I think the more interesting question is, why is it so hard to talk about anything other than Obama? His conduct of the presidency, his idea of the presidency, has a lot to do with this. But that's a speech and maybe 2 or 3 speeches, and we're not here to talk about that. But I think something else is going on, something that is a lot bigger and allows me to talk about something bigger and more important than, believe it or not, Barack Obama. Still, the fact is there is no getting away from Obama. And I discovered this before he was president, in January of 2007. That was when the freshman senator from Illinois announced he was running for president. It was about that time, 23 months before the 2008 election, that the senator from New York, Hillary Clinton, announced that she too was running for president. Well, in the weeks and months that followed, and I think that Kevin may support me on this, what my colleagues and I in the press discovered was, and at the time this really was a discovery, it was something new, it was that we had to write about Obama and Hillary all the time. Why? Because that was what our readers wanted to read about all the time. And how did we know that? Well, because whether you were writing for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, RedState.com, or the Daily Cause, you were now publishing your commentaries on the web. And the web's technologies, unlike print, can measure precisely how many people are reading what we wrote about Obama and Hillary. Well, we learned pretty fast. If you put the word Obama or the word Hillary in the headline, the measured readership always went up. But if I wrote something about, say, John McCain, it would go flat. It might even fall. So about 20 months later, towards the end of the Democratic primaries, I actually had nothing new whatsoever to say about Hillary Clinton. And I actually do recall coming to this city in March 2008 to cover the Democratic primary between Hillary and Obama. And I rushed in here and landed and drove straight to St. Edward High School gym because I wanted to see Bill Clinton do an appearance for his wife, Hillary Clinton. And it was a snowy day, and the spectacle of the former president talking in St. Ed's gym was something I didn't want to miss. And I drove at breakneck speed down the icy streets, putting my life at risk. And I got there just as the speech was ending, and people were streaming out of the gym, so I walked in beside them and I climbed up in the stands. And there, standing down under a basketball hoop, it was a great American scene, was the former president of the United States, surrounded by young students from St. Ed's, signing autographs, shaking hands, talking to him. He talked to them to the point where the Secret Service people had to finally grab him and pull him away. Bill Clinton was totally in his element. Well, the Hillary the next day, when I covered her, was in Youngstown, Akron, and finished the day literally about 9 o'clock at night right up the street here at Cleveland State University. I wrote 3 things about her that week in the primary, which she won because Obama had thrown in the towel, given up, and gone down to Texas. The 3 things I wrote was the women in those gyms in Youngstown and Akron and here absolutely loved her. She had incredible tenacity, and her message was almost totally negative. Now, did I keep writing about Hillary? I did, because she and Obama and the whole sprawling world of politics is what people wanted to read about. Why this is so wasn't so obvious back in January of 2007, but we all know what happened to our politics back then. This is what happened. These things: smartphones, technology, email, texting, blogs, cable news, and eventually Facebook tablets and Twitter. We at the Wall Street Journal were more or less ordered a little while ago to get onto Twitter. They told us, you got to be on Twitter, you got to start tweeting. You have to start doing the 140-character texting phenomenon. So I did. I am now on Twitter, and I tweet. I'm at Dan Henninger. That's my address. The first thing I want to say about this is that I wish the technology was not called Twitter. And I really wish they didn't call what you do with it a tweet, all right? The definition of Twitter is to chatter. And the definition of tweet is to chirp. Thus, chirping chatter is now the primary platform for transmitting and discussing politics in the United States. Now, there's really no point in complaining about this. This is the way it is now, and like everyone else, I have found a perch, a branch in one of the great trees of American politics, and I'm up there chirping, tweeting. Now, this new world of always-on politics, electronic politics, isn't the direct subject of my talk today, but it is the crucially important context for it. This is the age we live in, for better or for worse. So let's start with another question. What is the point of all this constant political ferment, all this political movement and agitation that all of us engage in now? Is any real good coming out of it? Or is always-on politics making the possibility of good political outcomes become more remote? What's going on in Washington right now, today, with the continuing resolution in the budget, suggests that good outcomes really don't happen very often anymore. So far, it seems that politics on steroids is making matters a lot worse. You all know what the opinion polls say about the public's trust or belief in government. It is very low. It is making Congress look like the Barnum and Bailey circus. Now, one school of politics holds that electronic always-on politics has trivialized politics. And in a way, I suppose it has. Previously, one of the jobs of newspaper editors was to sort through all the news on any given day and through all the news stories coming across the tickers and wire services, and then we would try to assign a hierarchy to these stories based on what seemed really important. So if we thought there was something you really should read, it would be up here in the newspaper. Something that maybe you could read would be over here, and the totally optional stuff would, of course, be down in the corner of the newspaper. Well, those days are gone. What's going on now is that you can read on the web. You'll get a story about, say, Obama's decision or is thinking about doing something to attack Assad in Syria. That will be right here. And then a story about Miley Cyrus twerking will be right there next to it, right? Now, if you don't know what the definition of twerking is, you're not going to hear it from this podium this afternoon. And if you don't know who Miley Cyrus is, I want to talk to you after I'm done. But what this mainly tells me is that however adept many of us think we have become at accessing political information electronically and manipulating it, we really haven't worked out a modus vivendi with this technology. We think we use it all the time, but I think it's using us. It's pushing us around, and this has implications for our politics. I think it's created an imbalance between the ever-accumulating weight of issues and problems in our political life on the one side, and this is the side that we seem to live in most of the time, and our seeming inability to do much of anything about them on the other side. In other words, to make progress. Now, note I said seeming inability. I think there may be life at the end of the Twitter tunnel, but we'll get to that in a bit. First, allow me to take you on a guided tour through, I guess, what I would call the heart of darkness in American politics right now. Now, for my money, the signal event that has led up kind of right to the present day occurred on September 14th, 2008. And that September Sunday was the beginning of the great financial meltdown, as some of you here well know. It seems to me, at least in my world, that Sunday is now one of those historic days when you can ask people, where were you the day it happened? And I know where I was. We were at a beautiful wedding on Maryland's eastern shore. It was just a perfect afternoon. And as the afternoon was ending, we had gone back to a really lovely room at the bed and breakfast alongside the Chesapeake Bay. And as I kind of sprawled backward on the bed just to relax and close my eyes, we had the television on Sunday, and there's a lady on the TV screen, and she's saying that Lehman Brothers was about to declare bankruptcy, and Bank of America was going to buy Merrill Lynch. Well, my eyes opened fast. I sat bolt upright, and I thought, Lehman is going bankrupt? Merrill Lynch, one of the crown jewels of Wall Street, has been sold off? Well, I thought, it is just not going to be the same from here on out. Well, it has not been. 5 years later, we are still living in what seems like a perpetual state of economic anxiety. Unemployment rose, touching 9%, and one reason it seems to be falling now is that growing numbers of people have simply stopped looking for work, and they don't get counted in the official statistics. The Great Recession itself ended in early 2009, and the strong growth that should follow any recession has never materialized. 4 years later, growth hovered, for 4 years anyway, growth hovered between next to nothing and 2%. Economists, as usual, can't quite agree on whether the economy is heading north or south. And Ben Bernanke's liquidity elixir, as I call it, QE, quantitative easing, may have levitated the stock market, but really, what else has it actually done? The Fed's 3-year zero interest rate policy makes me think of that wonderful 60s song, Do You Believe in Magic? Love and Spoonful, Rock and Roll Museum, class of 2000. I know them all. Youth unemployment. A little while ago, researchers at Northeastern University did a deep dive into the employment statistics. The youth unemployment rate, which is basically people, say, between their teens and their mid-20s, has been stuck through this period, 4 or 5 years, around 16%. But what these researchers found is that when you add in young people who are underemployed, who've taken jobs that are nowhere near their educational attainment, the unemployment and underemployment rate in the United States now is at about 50%. This is an incredible waste. Then the Euro crisis began, and half of Europe was facing the possibility that it was finally washed up. In France, 3 prominent private figures, started a website which was called Barrez-vous, which means in French, beat it, get out. The website's actual purpose has been to convince young French people that there is no future for them in their own country and that they should simply go somewhere else to find their future. In the United States, cities such as Stockton, San Bernardino, and Harrisburg in Pennsylvania began to declare bankruptcy after buckling beneath the weight of public pension obligations. Chicago's teacher went on strike, creating a devil's feast of oxymoron insofar as Chicago schools were failing when the teachers were on the job. The list of Washington, D.C. horribles is obviously familiar to all of you. The debt ceiling, the deficit, the failed negotiations over the deficit, the ticking entitlement bombs, even as we created a new entitlement, the Affordable Care Act, the neuralgic issue of immigration, and now the meltdown over the budget, possibly the shutdown of the government, another debt ceiling fight. Nonetheless, the best Washington can muster right now is a senator talking for 21 straight hours. It's a frightening spectacle, and the people know it. The most recent Pew poll found that trust in government is down to 26%. Before and after Obama's election, Congress's approval rating was below 20%. To me, this is a big deal. This is essentially a no-confidence vote in one of the 3 branches of government. And the interesting thing is, this is the one branch of government over which presumably we have the most control, the legislature, the one that represents us. And the American people are basically withdrawing their confidence in it. Foreign Affairs, North Korea, back on August 31st, restarted a plutonium reactor. Iran, despite its current smiley-faced president, is spinning 16,000 centrifuges to build the bomb. Assad is winning in Syria. China is hacking into everybody's email. A red line now depends on the meaning of red line. I don't know, have I left anything out here? Probably plenty. But recall again how all of these events, this news pours over us. It's as if we've been sentenced to stand beneath, by the ancient gods, to stand beneath some sort of information waterfall, and we are simply drenched in this stuff. Marshall McLuhan once said that all media works us over all the time. He said that in the early 1960s when there was nothing but black and white television. But events like those that I've described used to enter the news and then they would pass out of them. But now McLuhan saw what was coming. It's all in front of us all the time. virtually all the time. You cannot get away from this information, and a lot of the information is not good. Now, one is tempted to say that having so much news, so much bad news in our lives so continuously is an unnatural state of affairs. But that can't quite be true. If always-on politics, driven by always-on media, is the way we live now, then that is the new natural way of politics. And if what I've described was only beginning to happen to us right now, well, I'd have to say we'd be doomed. And for people of a certain, shall I say, political persuasion, it does sort of look right now like we are doomed. But anyone with energy left from being worked over all the time by politics, it seems to me, should try to look at what else is going on right alongside of it. Because it's possible that these new forces, as powerful as the ones I've described, could not be producing only negatively charged political particles. Surely something positive is happening in our politics today because of these forces. And I think it is. The first thing one notices in the political landscape is not only discontent, but challenges to the status quo. After the meltdown of 2008, two challenges emerged out there, one from the right and one from the left. That was the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement. Now, both movements have gotten plenty of criticism, and much of it has been deserved. But it seems to me they're both worth taking a closer look. What's important to note about these two phenomenons is that each wasn't just a single entity. There was never one Tea Party. That movement has always been a collection of individual groups all over the country which called themselves Tea Party because Tea Party essentially defined the one thing they had on their mind, which was to stop the upward trend of federal spending. They wanted it stopped or they wanted it reversed. And if I may say so, it's one reason we're at this impasse in Washington right now, because the Tea Party did have an effect on the Republican Party. They think their job now is to stop or reverse the flow of federal spending. Barack Obama and the Democrats clearly believe that it is their job to increase the rate of federal spending. And this is simply an impasse. They just can't agree on that, and that explains in no small part why what is going on down there is happening. Now, the Occupy movement used the same kind of modern media marketing techniques to attach the same name to disparate groups all over the country. I think my favorite Occupy group was Occupy Yellowknife, which occupied the North Pole, that famous hotbed of corporate mendacity. I was not a big fan of the Occupy movement. I remember going down to see the Occupy people in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan one beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I guess the one thing I learned about the Occupy movement is that the only way you can sleep outside on concrete for 2 months is if you're really, really heavily medicated. They were. Now, look, a lot, maybe most of the occupiers were simply against capitalism. But among them, you could find people whose objection was a little bit more refined than that. What they were angry about was what they called crony capitalism. They thought the political class and the capitalist class, as they understood it, had stacked the deck against them, which is kind of interesting, but because in great part, that's what the Tea Party thinks, that the politicians and the corporations have stacked the deck against them. Well, the Occupy movement didn't really produce any significant political figures, and since it was mainly a movement on the left, and with a Democratic man of the left in the White House, there really wasn't too much political space for new figures to emerge from the Occupy movement. The Tea Party movement back then produced some well-known candidate clinkers who damaged the Republican brand. More recently, though, I think we've seen the emergence of more formidable Tea Party figures, such as Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. Now, whatever you think of their politics, and personally, I think that Senator Cruz's recent assaults on members of his own party has been tremendously off base. Whatever you think of these guys, they are sophisticated political operatives who are posing a direct challenge to their party's status quo. Now, what makes it possible for a Rand Paul or indeed a freshman like Ted Cruz to do this? It's the existence of always-on media politics, which is impossible for us to avoid. You cannot hide from what people like Rand Paul or Ted Cruz are saying because they become so adept at using the system. Now let's venture a little bit further out into the media universe. If you focus the telescope sharply enough, I think what you see is one of the most famous and familiar things in American politics, something that goes all the way back to the days of the horse and the buggy whip. And that's a movement for reform of the American system. I think with luck, the future could bring a new age of reform, what would really be an historic cleansing of the system. Now, the members of the Loyola Society, it seems to me, need no introduction to the dynamics of reform. St. Ignatius brought the Society of Jesus to life as part of the Counter-Reformation. And that reform, like those in America, happened when the status quo had begun to discredit itself. And to a large extent, that's what's happening right now. Now, it was back around the time of last year's presidential election that I began to write that I thought we were heading into a new age of reform, and I mean big R reform. Now, I'm not saying this reform movement exists right now, but I think the forces are such out there that they could be put in motion and bring it to life. And I think it not only could exist, it should exist. Now, back during the Progressive era, reform centered primarily on rooting out political corruption. And the great reform movement of the 1960s, of course, was civil rights. I think this one is going to center on the economic vitality of the United States. For the past 100 years, the U.S. economy has averaged growth of about 3.3%. The fact is, great good has resulted from a growth rate of between 3 and 4%. For the past 5 years, we have grown at well below 2%. And we are in trouble, especially in a world of economic competitors, which puts downward pressure on incomes. And add in, of course, the unhappy social effects of the dire long-term job prospects of young people. And I think you have the making of a status quo that I believe the American people simply will not accept. They do not want to go in that direction long-term. Now, the good news, remember I promised a long time ago there was going to be some optimism here, is that this movement, this reform movement, it seems to me, does not have to be built from the ground up. It's already building. And I'm going to cite just 3 key things that makes me think pressure is building for real economic reform. The first area is tax reform. Now, does anyone doubt that reform of the U.S. tax system is necessary in some way right now? I mean, the scandals over the 501c3 and c4 movements is in part the result of the fact that if you looked, there are actually 18 or 19 categories of 501 designation. It is incredibly complex, just for starters. Under those circumstances, fraud, deceit, cheating is just going to be inevitable. And from the IRS's side, their ability to police a code like that becomes arbitrary and hard to predict. Well, it seems to me that there is more sentiment in Washington right now than any time I have seen since the Reagan presidency. There's real pressure to do real reform of the tax system. Dave Camp, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, where tax legislation, of course, has to originate, and the chairman of his counterpart in the Senate, Max Baucus, the head of the Senate Finance Committee, have been meeting continuously to put together a real reform bill. 2 bipartisan commissions, Bowles-Simpson and Domenici-Rivlin, proposed tax reforms that would simplify and flatten our tax system. Now, all tax reform has to start with leadership from the president, and at the moment, it's not obvious that that leadership is going to happen. But if we ever did get leadership from the White House, you could get tax reform, I think, in pretty short order. Now, the states out there are not waiting for Washington to act on taxes. A recent report from the National Conference of State Legislatures highlighted income tax cuts adopted this year in Iowa, Maine, Ohio, North Dakota, Wisconsin, And in addition, there have been even more substantial tax code reforms in North Carolina and Kansas. And I think that if growth is beginning to return at all to the U.S. economy, it may have a lot more to do with tax reforms in the states than anything that's going on in Washington right now. Let's talk a little bit about education reform. The relationship between having a good education and economic well-being, I don't think needs any elaboration to this group. It was for this reason that the charter school movement was born in the United States. Well, the charter school movement in the last 2 or 3 years has made political advances that few of us who have been supporting it for years ever would have predicted. And here the thunderclap year was 2011, when 13 states enacted significant charter school reform legislation. Louisiana, Indiana, Florida, Georgia, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and of course Ohio have all made progress in allowing more charter schools or some form of voucher program. In fact, 42 states have now created charter school laws, some, of course, better than others. Now, when one considers the forces that have been arrayed against the charter school movement, I would say this is pretty remarkable progress. And you actually might be happy to hear that the Center for Education Reform, which I think tracks this subject better than anyone, recently elevated Ohio to number 3 on its Parent Power Index. Now, you have to ask, and people do ask, does any of this school reform actually matter? Well, as some of you well know, as our opening prayer made clear, the Cristo Rey, a national Catholic charter movement that was indeed begun by the Jesuits, I wrote about them several years ago, and those high schools are putting virtually 100% of their high school graduates in college from some of the most deeply impacted city high schools in the United States. And that, of course, includes Martin de Porres up here on 61st Street, includes Cristo Rey School in East Harlem that I have visited. And as you know, the Cristo Rey movement simply does not cream the best kids out of those neighborhoods. They make a point of taking kind of out of the middle level. And they're putting nearly 100% of them into college. It's doable. This is true reform against the status quo. Public sector reform. Several years ago, we all woke up one day to discover that the deals that had been made with the public sector over many decades were strangling many cities. Detroit was once a jewel of the Great Lakes region. It's now in a coma. The Stockton and San Bernardino bankruptcies have absolutely rocked California. The state of Illinois is in the tank. Before 2005, you know the number of states were that were dealing with the public pension problem or addressing it, the debt bombs that they had to face? Absolutely zero. None. Since 2009, some 43 states have enacted changes in their retirement plans for public employees. Now, some are better than others, of course, but this is much, much better than mere talk. Again, if the economy begins to strengthen over time, it's going to be because some of these states have finally begun to address their public debt obligations. More importantly, it seems to me, there are signs of reform beyond the world of politics. Today, there's a new category of reformer called social entrepreneurs. We may have a number of social entrepreneurs here in the room today. Social entrepreneurs are basically private individuals who've decided they're not going to wait for the world of politics to solve what we call problems. And they're all discovering kind of new and striking ways to address what bedevils schools, families, the addicted, and other seemingly intractable problems in American society. Back in New York, there's a group that I'm very familiar with called the Manhattan Institute, and they've created an award, the Social Entrepreneur Award. And every year, for the past 5 or 6 years, they've given this award to 6 social entrepreneurs. And it's always striking to look at the list because these people really are doing good work. They're having success. Now, in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, there's a wonderful line in there, a wonderful passage about this American compulsion to social entrepreneurship. This is the way Tocqueville put it. Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send out missionaries. It is in this manner that the Americans have founded hospitals, prisons, and schools. Now, you know, it occurred to me, as I was pulling this together for the Loyola Society, that one really could say that Tocqueville's insight into the American impulse to organize private or civic associations on behalf of social progress is in fact very Ignatian. Indeed, I think it's very much in the Catholic tradition. And I think probably Ignatius of Loyola himself would have felt very much at home in the United States. He would have plugged himself right into this phenomenon. Tocqueville, however, also noted that in France, the government did all of these things. And largely that's been true for all of Europe. Now, that's an interesting point, it seems to me, for our discussion of reform. Because one of the most famous reform movements in the United States was indeed the Progressive Era. But that movement essentially said that average people were incapable of social and political reform, which instead had to be led by public policy experts and politicians. Well, we have now had 50 years of reform by experts. I'm not here to debate the efficacy of what the progressive movement did and the vast network of public programs that they have given us. But the point seems to be is that this long era of political activity in the United States has arrived at a moment where it often seems that it is no longer to produce much good using that model. The symptoms of this are what we encounter in the news, and because of the always-on present nature of the news that I've described at the outset, one often feels smothered by the seeming impossibility of forward movement. My takeaway today, and I'd really call it something more than a hope, is that there are good forces in motion out there in politics waiting to be harnessed and directed towards a reform movement to improve this country's economic well-being. Now, I'm going to end with a blunt reality because I think it just cannot be ducked. Ideas alone can't move people. Movements move people. A reform movement has to be led by someone. Now, there may be some 18-year-old sitting out there in a college dorm figuring out how to do all this using just Facebook and Twitter. I doubt it. For reform to become reality, it at some point has to emerge from our system of two-party politics. One of the most famous, honored reform movements of our lifetimes was indeed the civil rights movement. It was created and pushed and driven by Martin Luther King. But what Martin Luther King was doing could not have been possible unless Lyndon Johnson transformed that into the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s. Martin Luther King needed Lyndon Johnson to accomplish these things. Now, this is kind of a political downer because the political class is always going to be behind the curve. And I personally would hate to ever be seen in public saying something nice about politicians. But even here, it seems to me, it's possible to see individuals in politics right now who I think are capable of doing more good than harm. In short, of doing reform. A quick list on the Republican side would include Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, Mitch Daniels of Indiana, Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, Marco Rubio, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. And something tells me that your governor, John Kasich, has the itch to run too, despite his constant denials. I think he would call himself a reformer. My list of Democratic reformers is just a bit shorter, but maybe I'm biased. But still, there are people out there. My list would include, you all may not have heard of this lady, but she deserves more attention than the national media have given her. Gina Raimondo. This is the remarkable general treasurer of Rhode Island who almost single-handedly fixed that state's pension crisis. I'd add as well Mayor Julian Castro of San Antonio, Cory Booker, the former mayor of Newark, who's now running for the Senate in New Jersey, and Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. I think all of these people would welcome real reform. And lastly, it seems to me on the Democratic side, it just might be possible that after all these years, the list of reformers could include Hillary Clinton. Now, of all the things that I have said here today, and that includes you guys from the Plain Dealer, please don't let anyone know that I've been running around saying nice things about Hillary Clinton. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dan. We'll now begin our customary question and answer session. We have two gentlemen with a microphone. If you would just raise your hand and we'll call on you. And does anybody want to start with the first question? Well, I'll start. Dan, you had a classmate at Georgetown, Bill Clinton. Could you talk about the progression you saw between Bill Clinton as a college student and his political rise to the presidency?
Yeah, it's always great to start with an easy, non-controversial question. Well, okay, I'll start with a little personal anecdote. Why not? Told this enough in private circles. Yeah, Bill and I were at Georgetown at the same time. We were both members of the class of '68. And I must say that when he got the nomination for the Democratic Party, there were articles written, we were asked, did any of us think he would sometime be doing this? And we said, are you kidding us? We all knew he was going to run for president someday. I mean, if you walk down in Georgetown, it's in small streets, and you walk past to class back and forth, you walk by your classmates, and you know how it is when you're in college. If you're walking by somebody and you see somebody you know, you go, hey, how you doing, Jim? It's great to see you. With Bill, you could never get past him. He would always stop you and go, hey, Dan, how's it going? Things good with you? Everything all right? This is like every time you ran into the guy. And so he was compulsively political. And as I was telling the story this morning, he immediately got himself elected. There were two campus political organizations, the East Campus and the college. And he got elected president of the East Campus. Georgetown was a tremendously political place. It was truly like AAA ball for politics, and we played hardball, I must say. But he got elected president of the freshman class. He got elected president of the sophomore class. He got elected president of the junior class. And then he decided to run for president of the senior class of the East Campus. And his opponent at that point, I mean, after all, this was Bill Clinton, was a guy who was basically a nobody named Terry Modulin. And Modulin beat Clinton. And I understand Clinton thinks the election was stolen. But poor Modulin was so unknown how we couldn't have organized ourselves fast enough to steal the election for him. And I think the reason was that people had just kind of gotten tired of having Bill in their face all the time and decided to go in another direction. So after he got elected president of the United States, some of my friends weren't too happy about that. I said, no problem, one-term president, the American people will get tired of him. But I guess it just goes to show that the Georgetown Student Party had a little bit more sophistication on the uptake. But no, he's been a remarkable figure in the country's public life. So occasionally I run past him in New York from time to time. We haven't had any great sit-down sessions, but I think we're probably going to have to get used to the reality of his wife running for president, and it's going to be interesting because eventually people will have to come to grips with the fact that it isn't just Hillary, that Bill will be there too. And that's, pretty unprecedented, and I think we're going to have to see whether the American people are quite willing to sign up for it. I'm not sure what they'd be signing up for. People say co-presidency, but, Bill's not a shrinking violet. He's a total player. He was a player in the last election. And if you think that if she gets elected and he's going to go sit in the corner, there is just not going to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Henninger. What, in your opinion, or what, in your estimation, has been the single most influential reform movement in the history of the world?
Slam dunk. Jesus Christ. I mean, clearly, that's, we've all been kind of the products of it and around it. And, I was just just this thought just kind of jumps into my head, but a lot of us have gone through periods after the 1960s and so forth, and a lot of people, friends of ours, dropped out of the church, and they'd say things like, I really can't come to grips with the church's position on contraception, or, man, the guitar masses are driving me nuts. And anyone who's familiar with the history of the church, through the early Middle Ages, and I have a Jesuit brother who teaches medieval philosophy at Georgetown, as some of you know, and I think the world would be a lot better off if more people studied medieval philosophy. But the history of the church through those periods, and the complexity and the contributions by the church fathers, and the readings of the church fathers, and even the popes, is just so rich and huge that it seems to me that have the good fortune to be part of it is in some ways an honor, and that the idea that there were people in our time, and I think to some extent it was the fault of the church. I think there was a big marketing problem there, that they could have done a better job of convincing people that there was something bigger and greater and richer and more complex that they should stay part of. And we were just, Kevin and I were just chatting about this at lunch, as a matter of fact, and he was raising the possibility that the current pope looks like he just might have the gift to start connecting like that with people again. And I agree with Kevin. I think this is going to be a really, really interesting papacy in enlarging the vision of what Catholicism stands for.
Just a quick question. If you would just comment about some of the Jesuits that impacted your life, your education at St. Ignatius and Georgetown.
Well, this is actually kind of a follow-on to what I was just saying, because when I was at Georgetown, we, of course, had a lot of Jesuit scholastics in the school, and eventually got to the point where there weren't so many of them. I guess I'm going to mention Father Metzger, Clement Metzger. Was he down at Walsh? Yeah, I did. And what an amazing figure he was. A fabulous teacher. Really was a fabulous teacher, as were many of the other young scholastics and Jesuit priests we had at the time. And they were men. I mean, they were solid guys, and you were influenced by that, both by their intellect and the fact we all realized that these were really smart guys. And I just can't resist this anecdote because it's I love it. We were also smart guys in many respects, and sometimes too smart for our own good. And I don't know, my classmate here, Paul Ziegler, I don't know, were you in this class or not, but somebody really acted up in Father Metzger's Latin class, and he had a short fuse and blew up and took us up to the 4th floor after school and proceeded to give us this incredibly complex mathematical problem, which involved doing addition like out to the 15th or 20th point. It was just incredible. And this was going to take a long time to get right, and you were going to have to sit there until you got that thing right. So, the rest of us were just sitting there going, like, adding and adding and adding. About 10 minutes later, one of the nerds in the class walks up, goes like this. And Metzger looks down at this thing and goes, "Get out of here." We win. It was great. But those were good times.
Is there a Republican out there that can beat Hillary Clinton, do you think?
Interesting question. In that, part of me has always felt that, no, we won't get in trouble with this. In some respects, Hillary was a bit of an odds-on favorite to win if she ran, if only because it's another historic presidency. And the argument has always been that so many women would vote for her. If you add that to the base that Obama already has, she's a shoo-in. And believe me, as I said in the talk, I was in a gym down in Akron and in Youngstown. It was mostly blue-collar women. And man, they loved her. She was hitting it out of the park. It was really good. She's up there turning to these people and unfurling these ideas of hers, and they were going nuts. So I've always kind of thought she was odds on to win, unless the United States ended up in a situation where what was in front of people was more important than Hillary Clinton's presidency. And I have to say, we're there right now with what's going on in foreign policy. What has just happened in Syria, the so-called negotiations with Iran. I personally think the president is just going a little bit off the rails at the moment. And if you add in the economy, if that economy does not strengthen, my God, over the next 3 years, getting back up above 3%, I think Hillary, if she chooses to run, could be faced with a real challenge. And Chris Christie, God knows, has the political gifts to contend with her. Very charismatic. Scott Walker in Wisconsin, I don't know how many of you have ever heard him or been around him, also has a kind of everyman charisma that can connect with people. And this is not going to be Mitt Romney. These are professional politicians. They know how to play the game at the highest level. So I'm a big fan of Jeb Bush. I understand the argument against him, the Bush name and all that. But I've seen Jeb give talks on education and immigration in front of groups like this, bipartisan groups, and people walk out going, man, I really liked what I heard. So I don't think she's a shoo-in. I think that, well, let me back that up a little bit. This is kind of like a question you can anticipate. What's going on right now in Washington among the Republicans is, in my opinion, just totally destructive. I mean, they are creating so many divisions among themselves with what's going on between Cruz and Mike Lee and the defund Obamacare and so forth. A lot of the outside groups are just, I get emails that you wouldn't believe, attacking people, attacking us for like being rhinos because we aren't agreeing with Ted Cruz. And the intensity of it is such that these people are creating a situation, I think, where you could get personal grievances and animosities among players in the Republican Party. They're going to be a little difficult to smooth over if this thing doesn't go away sometime soon. So we're all watching it. It's just kind of interesting to see how this plays out day by day. But at the moment, I mean, I mentioned, Scott Walker and Chris Christie and so forth, but at the moment, Ted Cruz is stealing a march on these guys. And he's creating a fundraising base and an email list. And listen, make no mistake about it, those 21 hours, I mean, he had a website, he had TV commercials on Fox with an 800 number, you had to give an email address. He's building an email address because you got to raise upwards of $1 billion to run for the presidency now. And you got to start raising that money right now. And he's doing a pretty good job of it.
On the far side of the room there.
Mr. Henninger, I'll give you the option to respond to this question or to not respond. It's critical and controversial. You appear frequently on CNBC. Last week, one of the entrepreneurs who sold his business for hundreds of millions of dollars was interviewed. The discussion inured to Obama. The expression that came from him was, he is criminally incompetent. Would you elaborate or decline?
Well, just to put in a small plug for one of my sometimes employers, it's actually Fox Business that I appear on most of the time. CNBC is the enemy. But having said that, how can I put this? I don't think he's criminally incompetent, but I think that the president is beginning to show some of the vulnerabilities that were always existed in his candidacy. Freshman senator, had only been in the U.S. Senate for a year, had been a member of the state Senate. Some of us sometimes around the office say, look, the presidency and running for the presidency is the major leagues. You've got to have major league political skills to do either thing. And I think it's becoming apparent that while Obama has tremendous campaign skills, and he had tremendous organization behind him, I don't think he has major league political skills as far as Washington is concerned. He basically just doesn't talk to the members of Congress, okay? I mentioned LBJ in the 1965 Civil Rights Acts. If you've read Robert Caro's biographies of LBJ, and I'm sure some of you have, the detail about LBJ working with Congress and members of Congress and finding what he needed from them was just incredible. And Obama does not do any of that. And I think we're showing some of the problems that have resulted because of it. There is a vacuum, a political vacuum in Washington right now, which is to say most of the members, Democratic or Republican, run for office, come to Washington for what reason? They want to do politics. They're into politics, and politics means doing this with other people and the other side. And at the moment, that's not happening in Washington, and I think as a result of you having all of these intense people down there who want to do politics, that absent the communication or give and take that LBJ or Bill Clinton, I think almost any president would have become involved in, you're seeing a lot of extreme behavior, a lot of almost craziness, and I think a little of that is what's been going on with Ted Cruz. And speaking of Cruz, speaking of Obama, and speaking indeed of a guy I really kind of like and admire, Marco Rubio, I've got a rule of thumb now. I'm done with rookie presidents.
One more question.
Following up on that, I was just FYI, I was a column of Kevin's for many years, and now I stay home and read the. I'm fortunate enough to be able to read the 3 newspapers that land on my driveway every morning. Well, usually 3 newspapers. Sometimes it's only 2. But you had an editorial this morning that seemed to, you might disagree with this, distribute the blame for what's going on today and tomorrow equally between Senator Cruz, whom the Journal has been critical of for over a week on this issue, and President Obama. Given that the fact that the Affordable Care Act was passed 2 years before the 2012 election, he was reelected by 5 million votes, an electoral landslide. The Supreme Court upheld it. Don't you view, how would you further expand on that, on this latest showdown being, being half, so to speak, half Obama's fault and half Cruz's?
Well,
one more thing, if I may. Your great fear is probably coming true. There's a CNN poll that was released a couple hours ago that showed that the American people who are making up their minds are blaming the Republicans for this.
yeah, no surprise there. That's one of the great risks. And it's, for the Republicans, it's a pity because the polls were beginning to go in their direction on handling the economy, foreign affairs, and the president's approval rating was down to about 43 or 42%. To some extent, I don't sort of disagree with the drift of your question. The defund Obamacare strategy was always a non-starter. It is the law. There was never any prospect whatsoever that the Democrats were going to sign on to it. If by some theoretical miracle it had passed and gone to the president, he would have vetoed it, and then you would have needed more than 60 votes to override. It's just not going to happen. Instead, it seemed to me, and this is kind of in the news at the moment with the current state of play, where the House, Speaker Boehner, for all we know as we're standing here, or sitting here, is going to pass a resolution that delays Obamacare for a year, just as the administration itself delayed the employer mandate for a year, and has a provision to eliminate the medical device tax that's in Obamacare, which has bipartisan support. Both Republican and Democratic senators support that because they've kind of discovered, since the law was passed, that taxing medical devices is going to suppress medical device development, not something that any of us would want to do. So That is the sort of thing that it seems to me should be negotiable between the White House and the Republicans. Because I think the Republicans, most of this was going to take place in the negotiation over the debt ceiling. Boehner did not want to get into this over the continuing resolution, A, because the shutdown would damage the Republicans, and B, because you just want to pass a budget and get that behind you. They were going to negotiate over the debt resolution, and the card that they were going to play, and may still play, was to lift some of the sequester caps, give the Democrats and the president that, in return for give on, say, the medical device tax or delaying Obamacare for a year. And given all the stories about the difficulties with the software, who knows, they might have agreed to that while they got the thing pulled together. But for that to happen, the president has got to become engaged, and he's the one who's been saying he will not negotiate over the debt ceiling. So, you know, at the moment, it looks like a train wreck in Washington. And the big question is, as your question suggests, how is this going to shake out 2 years from now in the midterm elections? 2014, are the Republicans going to retain control of the House? Are they going to lose seats? Or are they going to blow themselves up? And I don't know, I guess it kind of comes around to the basic theme of my talk today. We're all obviously aware of what's going on. We're aware of what's going on, it seems to me, in a way, with an intensity that we never really had in the past. And it's that intensity that forms our own views about things, for better or worse. And I'm not a technophobe. This is, as I said, a technology that we've all got to live with. But it's just kind of interesting to me what effect something as is happening in Washington right now is going to have in either a positive or a negative way. I mean, if the Republicans lose the House in 2014 because they blew themselves up, the two parties are going to be even further apart than they are right now, and the situation could be worse than ever. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope this process sobers them up. I don't think too many of them are enjoying what they're going through right now, so we'll just have to see. Check your email when you leave the building. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We have a bottle of wine from our Ignatian vineyard in Australia.